This episode was taped in October 2023. Some references to current events and content may be outdated.
Okay, get this. You and your young group of teens and 20-somethings, you make the thing, and it turns out awesome. So awesome that people are asking for a second of the thing that you just made. Life is good. Except no, it isn't. As a matter of fact, life is not at all good because you don't own your IP anymore because you can't read contracts and all the money for that is now tied up in something else. But you say, wait a minute, me and my friends are better than this, and there's a loophole. We can do it again if we just make a second version of the thing. This is the story of Evil Dead 2 on this episode of The Return of the Movie.
And hello everyone, and welcome back to The Return of the Movie. I am Ben, and today we are continuing our Evil Dead coverage with, of course, Matthew. Okay, so first of all, Matt, a lot of questions today. We're talking about Evil Dead 2 finally, so tonally, we know what these films are. Why exactly have you been so gung-ho about covering this series?
This is probably one of the most unique horror franchises out there, in that even though there's definitely like a formula to it after a while, they never quite do the same thing twice in a row. We start out with this like little cabin in the woods, like proto-slasher zombie movie that feels honestly like evil incarnate, to something inspired by the Three Stooges in this one. And then we have something that's closer to like friggin' Conan the Barbarian in the next one than it is to like a horror film. It's such a unique little presence in the horror genre for so many reasons, and it's also centered around like a singular protagonist, which doesn't normally happen in horror.
Yeah.
And this movie is the movie where Ash becomes Ash, where Bruce Campbell really comes into his own as a performer. And so you have this perfect blend of horror and comedy, and then this franchise can throw more comedy at points, or in other movies like the first one, it's more just straight up horror, but whatever it does, it usually does it pretty well. And so there's just a million different directions the series canon does go in, and because of that, there's just a million different things to talk about with it.
Yeah, first of all, starting off, you're absolutely right. One of the only other films that we've talked about on this show that has a central cast, or at least even a protagonist, has been Scream, which means that, oddly enough, other than being two of the better sort of horror comedies, they also share having this very simple storytelling device in common that just makes them stand out from their horror counterparts.
It really does. I mean, with Scream, those movies have gone on for so long, and that they're kind of starting to cycle out one cast for another to, I guess, mixed results depending on who you ask. But with Scream, at least, it's still kind of the same story beats pretty much every single time. Like, sure, you have different killers, different amounts of killers, or slightly different motivations each time, but it's still kind of the same movie in a lot of ways. With Evil Dead, they just kind of go off the wall.
Yeah, this film, I definitely got to the point where I was... First of all, the entire... As we were getting into this, again, last episode I stated that I was emotionally prepared for a horror comedy, and Evil Dead 1 is decidedly not that. It is just a pure horror film, and it's low budget, it's kind of dingy, but it is really pulling off what it wants to do really well. And a big part of that is the fact that it's a student film, that first one at least, and the fact that they essentially come back and then make kind of a remake and then give it the budget that you actually probably would want the first one to have, but then tonally just decide not the same thing. Not the same thing at all. We're going to do physical comedy. There's going to be a moment where this man grabs his hands and has to not hit himself with his own hand. And like the Three Stooges comparison, you've made that one a lot while we've been talking about it in private, but you can tell that it's more than just a comparison. You can really tell that it's an influence when watching this.
One of the other influences on this, believe it or not, is like a hamburger helper commercial from like the 70s. Like there's specific beats where I think when the hand is like dragging him across the floor after it's knocked him out. Apparently there was a moment that I think Scott Spiegel, who was one of the writers on this, saw in a hamburger helper commercial and wanted to combine it with like the Three Stooges. And so there's like, yeah, if I can find that commercial, I'm going to post it in the comments. I just, again, digging up a commercial from 50 years ago.
You can't, I feel like you buried a lead here. I feel like we should be talking more about the hamburger helper commercial than the actual movie now. Yeah, tonally, I thought that the shift was like actually kind of incredible, though. I wouldn't say that it was well pulled off, because I was mostly just confused, but I was also having a good time. So that was my question to you, is that it's a pretty, tonally at least, it's a very big departure from what we just saw with Evil Dead. If you picture this, it's 1980, I think this one was 87. It's 1987. All you know is this like creepy, disturbing little film that is really hard to get your hands on. But it's like the kind of movie that you see late at night and you feel dirty after watching it. And then you go see this right after that. You're not going to be prepared for what they're doing. This first film, this second film is what actually started the cult following that we know. This is what gives shape to Army of Darkness and Ash vs. Evil Dead. And the entire Evil Dead reboot and Rise of Evil Dead, those are separate entities within themselves from what I understand, but do have some tie-ins. But this is culturally...
They are actually in the same canon, believe it or not.
Really?
There's not really anything tying into it, but the creatives all came out and said, yeah, no, we're not trying to erase the other canon. This is just separate stories within the same world.
Do you think that there is a multiverse problem for the Evil Dead franchise?
They've never really seemed... I mean, obviously, the series has, like, time travel and stuff like that and dimensional shifting, but, like, I don't know that there's, like, a multiverse in this specifically. Now, part of the problem is that if we're to believe that Ash versus the Evil Dead and then the 2013 remake or reboot or however you want to frame it are in the same universe, you're gonna get tonal whiplash. And so I think it's maybe not like a multiverse issue so much as it is as a tonal consistency issue. But they've also described that they want kind of like two specific directions they want this series to go in. One of which is going to follow the more serious, grounded tone of what Fede Alvarez did in 2013 and what the most recent one is doing as well. And then this goofy, just off-the-walls slapstick that Raimi and Bruce Campbell and company are doing.
Yeah, I will say for the audience, if you want more on the general history of the Evil Dead, Matt is currently doing an entire coverage of the history of the Evil Dead from movie through movie, all in video.
And before the first movie, too.
Ooh, there we go. Oh, yes, that is true. Yeah, that should be coming out, sometimes this week or next week. I forget. Time's weird and content release schedules are a difficult thing. Speaking of a difficult thing, so we actually had an audience question last week that seems to be a little bit more pointed towards this second film. Patron Twilight Goddess has asked, the original Evil Dead was always funny to me because Bruce Campbell is an absolute gem. This was one of the first horror films that tricked me, especially when the main character has a full-on melee session with the witch from the basement. However, the remake was much more psychological and spine-chilling. From the scene where the woman was basically R-worded by the briar vines to the possession hand dismemberment, to the secret in the basement, I was disgusted, intrigued, and overall disturbed. I have not seen the 2013 Evil Dead remake. However, it seems that there was a little bit of a melding, at least for that remake, of the two films, Evil Dead 1 and Evil Dead 2. in order to accomplish that, because we see both the vine scene in the begin that really did not happen in Evil Dead 2, but happened in Evil Dead 1, and then the hand dismemberment scene, which is exclusively Evil Dead 2. Also,
there's also a gag with a chainsaw in the remake.
There was also a chainsaw moment in the original, but it wasn't played for laughs. It was played really kind of melancholy and disturbing. It's one of those things where when I was first reading this, I was looking at this and I was like, okay, I understand where they might be coming from on the remake being more disturbing, but I felt really unsettled and like thrown off my groove by the first film, where this one I was, again, mostly just charmed. It was fun, it was disturbing, there were scary moments within Evil Dead 2, but overall I was just kind of having a fun time. And it's kind of that layer of when comedy and morbidity and horror intersect, and they have such a weird relationship because horror is all about creating tension and then holding it for release, which is also what comedy is. But they are tonally opposites. So I guess, Matt, on that, like, if you have to look at this comment and analysis, I feel like this applies so much more to Evil Dead 2 than Evil Dead 1.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is that this movie and Army of Darkness especially are why this franchise has the legs that it does. It's why that it has like such a devoted fan base, and it's why that these actors are still getting paid to sign pictures at conventions 40 years later, you know? It's like, we just, especially, again, I think the only other star in terms of like just how charismatic they are on camera might be Robert Englund with Freddy Krueger, at least from that era. Because, like, I don't know how much you've seen the Nightmare on Elm Street films, but Freddy kind of becomes the star of the show by the end of them, and he kind of becomes like an evil Deadpool kind of thing, where he's like saying like Arnold Schwarzenegger style one-liners as he's cutting someone up, or whatever it is he's doing to them.
Was that 80s or 90s when we
Nightmare? Oh no, that's mid 80s is when they
started. Mid 80s.
84, I think, was the first one. So they would have been on their second or third film by the time this one came out. Like, Bruce Campbell really carries this movie, and I think this comment or question really shows that star power that he has, which he really doesn't have in that first one. He's just kind of there.
No, I said it last episode. He's just kind of this sweet guy. He's like really innocent compared to his other co-stars in the first film, where in the second one, it's reframed as a solo trip of him and his then partner out to this what's supposed to be abandoned cabin, just the two of them, no groups of friends, no additional people that he has to care for, at least in the beginning. And then it goes off the rails when she's possessed and he has to kill her, and these people walk in to a man covered in blood with a dismembered hand and a supposedly body somewhere. I forget if he like did a good job disposing of the girlfriend, or if they just didn't find her for some reason. Because that entire opening sequence. Well, the entire opening sequence is like, first of all, some of my favorite puppetry I've ever seen in a horror film. The entire dancing scene of her body rising from the grave and then coming back to try and finish him off is a phenomenal sequence.
It's definitely like proto Tim Burton style, you know?
It gives me the same vibe, except like that was one of the moments where in this film I was like, it's weird, but I don't know whether to be funny or uncomfortable.
Yeah, exactly.
And then, like, as this film goes on, God, when the Vine scene happened again, I was like, oh no, there's going to be a sexual assault again. And that ended up not happening. It ended up just being she gets dragged into a tree at a very, very fast rate, and that's it, she's dead. Which still, actually more horrifying in my opinion, of just being able to get offed by some branches like that. But it also, at the same time, it did exactly what I don't like with sexually suggestive scenes where it made the assault, or in that case, even though it wasn't a sexual assault, it still tried to make it a titillating scene, which is big disapproval in my opinion. But again, we are talking about a film made in the 80s. So I do have to understand that some things are a product of their time. We can disapprove of them now, but c'est la vie.
Well, and then when the kills happen in this movie, they're still brutal. That's the thing. This movie is as brutal as it is funny. Just because it focuses on the comedy, we're seeing a guy cut his own hand off, and it's the funniest thing in the world, but he's still covered in blood and screaming in pain as it's happening.
Oh my god, the blood effects in this film were ridiculously over the top. So, a little sneak peek for those that are not familiar with our other show, Die Time. We're going to be doing a Evil Dead based one-shot or Evil Dead parody one-shot at the end of this month in October 25th, for those of you wondering. And in that moment, when I said this to Matt and I walked up into him and said, tonally, what should I be going for? He said, make the gore as over the top as possible. And, like, you can go as ridiculous as you want. I was like, okay, bet. That sounds like it's going to be so much fun. And then I watched this film, and I wasn't expecting, like, a literal, like, fire hydrant of hose, like, hose blood, fire hydrant hose blood. Yeah, that's a real sentence. Fire hydrant pressure blood to be coming out of the basement in any of those scenes. Like, I almost wonder, like, from an 80s or, like, at the time sort of standpoint, was that faux pas? Was that in style to be like, you know what's really scary? Unrealistic amounts of blood being spewed everywhere when someone enters a room.
Well, there's a really famous scene in the first Nightmare on Elm Street that might compare. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I believe so, but go on and continue.
All right, spoilers. Do you care if I spoil this?
Spoiler warning for our audience for Nightmare on Elm Street.
All right. So Johnny Depp has one of the most memorable deaths in that entire horror franchise. It's his first ever film role in Wes Craven's Nightmare on Elm Street. He gets sucked into his bed, and then this friggin' geyser of blood just starts spurting everywhere. And it's like they used like a couple hundred gallons of blood for that scene, you know, and obviously the human body only has something like 8 pints, so so like that's the other scene that like might compare to this. As far as just in general, like you gotta understand that like by this point in the 80s, all of the other horror franchises had kind of exploded onto the scene. Friday the 13th was on, I think, its 5th or 6th movie by this point. Nightmare on Elm Street was about to make its 3rd, I think. Halloween was about to make its 4th. Texas Chainsaw Massacre was going, and it just keeps going and on and on. And so one of the things with horror franchises that you get is a sense of power creep in terms of how powerful the antagonist is, how brutal the kills are, how many kills you get, how much blood gets shown on screen. There was one of the Friday the 13th movies where like the Friday the 13th movies get better as they stop taking themselves so seriously. So there's like a kill in one of them where Jason picks up this girl who's sleeping in a sleeping bag and then uses her to bludgeon somebody else in a sleeping bag, and it's just the goofiest thing.
We do talk a lot about the not just the concept of power creep, but actually the 80s renaissance for horror films, just because I feel like a lot of what we talk about when we're examining franchises and this is called the return of the movie for a reason. We are looking specifically at sequels and franchises and how they evolve over time. And every time we are talking about horror, ultimately we come back to this era, at least within filmmaking, which we can potentially point at the fact that it's so comedically driven based off of some of the power creep that was going on in other films at the time.
Well, part of it is that they didn't even want to do the cabin in the woods scenario for this movie to begin with. They wanted to just go straight into Army of Darkness after the first one.
Spoilers if you haven't seen the film. Suddenly he gets sucked back in time at the end, and we get the setup for Army of Darkness. And also throughout the entire film, there's moments when they're looking through the Necronomicon where we see what is very obviously Ash holding a chainsaw as like, this is going to be the savior of all, who's going to defeat all the Deadites as foretold by legend. And it's just some foreshadowing to the film that they actually wanted to make. Which, again, this is not an Army of Darkness discussion, but oh my god, did they get the budget to do that film correctly when you actually see Army of Darkness versus that final scene in this film, which I think is just fucking hysterical. But
so this, yeah.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Because I was just laying that out for our audience.
So yeah, no, like how strange would it have been if you go straight from that first Evil Dead movie into this medieval fantasy thing, like this dark fantasy movie? Like how, like, I don't think this franchise would have been as successful as it was. They were kind of forced into redoing the first one a little bit. All right, so this movie has a fascinating production history. If you'll just give me a few minutes to
go on, yeah.
So they were actually talking about doing a sequel while they were shooting the first one and what the sequel would look like. And Sam Raimi and Ted Raimi, who plays the Henrietta in the basement, like the zombie in the basement, Scott Spiegel, like everybody who was involved in the first one behind the scenes were like, let's go back in times to the medieval times. They wanted to do that, but because this movie, the first Evil Dead kind of took some time to find its legs, and it started getting a cult following when Stephen King saw it and gave it a good review. And so Stephen King has a large part of responsibility for the success of this franchise. Sam Raimi kind of moved on and started like working in Hollywood and worked with a young Coen brothers on like his second film, where the two of them were screenwriters and he was the director. And then eventually they kept re-releasing the first one throughout the early part of the 80s, and it had enough legs internationally to where they were like, well, okay, maybe we can do this again. The problem is that they couldn't find funding. And because this one, the first one was entirely self-produced, they had to contact a whole bunch of distribution companies to get this thing out there. And so the rights situation, like the copyright situation for the first one, is a total mess. They had a very, very difficult time getting the rights back to their own movie. And so when they did the second one, they were asking for, I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of somewhere between 13 and 15 million to make the second one. It took them years to find funding. And when they found someone who was willing to give them money, he only gave them about 2/3 of what they wanted, and which wasn't enough to do what they wanted to do with Army of Darkness to begin with. And so that was one of the reasons for the pivot. But the other reason for the pivot is, again, horror movies had turned into massively popular franchises left and right in the 80s. And so the guy who gave them funding gave it to them with the condition that he gets another Cabin in the Woods movie. And so they didn't have the funding for Army of Darkness, and they were kind of like contractually obligated to basically do the first one over again. They didn't really just want to do like a remake or just like a lazy sequel of just doing the same thing again. They wanted to do something different, but they also wanted to keep it in the same continuity. But because they didn't have the rights to the first one, they couldn't include flashbacks or like a recap scenes or anything like that. So the first 10 minutes of the movie, the reason why it's like that is that they had to shoot a little recap to jog the audience's memory. Yeah. And so that's why everything is so abridged and compressed. But like Bruce Campbell even came out in an interview and said that they shot it the way they did so that if you wanted to do this, you could cut off. You could stitch the first two movies together with the ending where he's like walking out of the cabin and he gets attacked by the camera at the end.
Okay.
You could stitch that to where he's being thrown through the woods in the second one, and it would be like one continuously long thing. Now there are some fan theories that kind of there's like one fan theory that I saw, like for an in-universe explanation, that Ash just keeps getting thrown into a time loop.
I saw that one as well, actually.
And so that's a fun little thing. But it's like one of the weird quirks of this franchise because each movie is owned by a different company. Like they can't even release all of these things on DVD together.
Are you serious?
Like all of the there's no box set for this stuff. They're all individually owned on Blu-ray. If you go to the Blu-ray Evil Dead, the first sentence on like the little description on the back of the Blu-ray is that Ash has 3 dead friends and an angry spirit after him. So like Evil Dead 2 still considers the first one 100% canon.
I was under the impression that Evil Dead 2 did not consider those first 10 minutes canon. it as a matter of fact was like he's alone only with his girlfriend this time. Different trip entirely. So I was like under the impression of just like, oh wait, am I getting like into some multiverse shit before all this shit goes down? What's happening? And then I was like, you know what? Time travel's a thing. Maybe we have maybe this is explained by an alternate timeline of like the first film being one where he has not gone back in time to influence the Necronomicon, but the second one is he's gone back in time, but that doesn't work because the second one is informed that he went back in time via the Necronomicon, so that's a continuity error. And I'm just gonna say, for my video game players, I'm a Legend of Zelda fan. I am very used to convoluted timelines and trying to figure out where the fuck things go. I thought that Evil Dead was going to have the same problem, but now I'm learning that this problem is actually from distribution and copyright. How did they keep the IP for even the title and premise? Because it's so specific. Was the Necronomicon fudged in there so that they could remake the film?
Well, it's more that it's not like they lost the rights to the property as a whole. It's more just that specific movie's distribution rights were all over the place. And so there was specific stuff with like, especially there was something with the international distribution that they had a hard time recovering. And so it's not like where, I don't know, another decent example of something like this happening would be Night of the Living Dead, where they screwed up the copyright paperwork, or they lost the rights to it somehow. So like a year or two after Night of the Living Dead got released, it was sent into public domain, which is why you can see it everywhere.
Ooh.
It's not as extreme of a case of that. So they still have the right. I think it was like they had the domestic rights to Evil Dead, but not the international ones or something like that. It's really convoluted. There's like specific nuances that they like overlooked when they were making that first one, because the first one was a student film and they had to just do whatever the fuck they could to get funding, to get it in front of people. And like if you see the one I'm talking about of the short film that they made to kind of act as a proof of concept for the first one, they had to take that shit door to door basically to get it funded. And so it doesn't surprise me that in the process of doing that they didn't properly secure everything, or they took risky deals that you would never take if you had the funding not to.
And this is In the Woods that we're talking about, or Into the Woods?
Within the Woods, yes.
Within the Woods.
Within
Not
the
the
Woods,
musical.
yes.
No singing or fairy tale crossover yet. That is Army of Darkness. That is all there. I feel like there is a weird Venn. Why does Evil Dead have such a weird Venn diagram of what it has in common with things? And one happens to be on multiple facets, both on name and partial premise, Into the Woods. Okay, so I have to jump to one other thing that I really want to talk about today. We now know that Evil Dead 1, in that version, if you were possessed by a Deadite, which finally get named at the very end of this film when we go back to medieval times, but if you get possessed by a Deadite, it's like, that's it. It's game over for you. You're as good as dead. At least that is what we thought. In this film, we see examples of surviving possession, which leads into an interesting fan theory that I found online. So this is a post on Reddit in the Evil Dead subreddit by user It's Raining Havoc, titled, Theory on Surviving Deadite Possession. For a while, I had a theory regarding those who survived Deadite possession. Essentially, surviving possession grants you extreme durability and possibly a bit of strength. After being possessed, Ash is thrown through a car window into a tree, has the force and stamina to cut off his own hand, which is understandably very hard to do, and survives contact with surfaces and liquids that would in most situations probably result in third-degree burns, all without any scarring, aside from the obvious not having a hand. And then spoilers for both Ash vs. Evil Dead and the Evil Dead remake. Then there's Mia and Kelly. Mia is able to find the strength to rip her arm out from under a car, and then, much like Kelly, is able to go toe-to-toe with Deadites and kill them with relative ease. Those are examples I can remember anyway. Let me know if there are any examples that support or disprove this idea. So I think we're going to touch on this when we get back to the next film, because I can think of a handful from there. And
I'll be right back, actually.
Okay. Matt just stood up. We are a live show to some extent. I will have to go here while we remember. There's sometimes oh, god damn it. For audio listeners, I'll have to explain this bit now. Matt just came back with a dismembered hand. A plastic one, I believe. It is plastic, right?
It's like rubber latex.
Okay, good. Yeah. But as far as examples from this film, Ash does remarkably well after this point, to the point where I almost want to give it a little bit of credence. Like, throughout the entire film, first of all, when we are introduced to the Necronomicon, we're introduced to the fact that he is supposedly the savior in a not-so-subtle mural of him with a chainsaw traveling back in time. Second, at the end of the film, for those that know their Lovecraftian mythos, he faces off with a monster that is only really comparable to a Lovecraftian Shoggoth, which is this big amalgamation of essentially eyes, skin. There's some tentacly things going on, but for the most part, it's just this bulbous, swollen body that has taken on this really monstrous eldritch form. And he's able to rip himself away from it really easily, from something that seems like, at least, it should be game over the second that he's in contact with it.
Well, also the fact that he doesn't just pass out from blood loss or shock of cutting his own hand off.
And
yeah,
it also seems like he starts going through a bit of psychosis as well. One of the crazy things is you don't actually know where the line between the Deadite Possession and psychosis really lives. Which, by the way, when we do our Call of Cthulhu one shot for Die Time, I'm gonna have a lot of fun with that. But
you're gonna destroy us in that.
Yeah, no one's gonna know what reality is. But it
does seem like reality just like falls apart from the seams. Like, one of my favorite scenes in this entire thing is when he's just laughing in the room, and like there's like that gag with the lamp, and like the deer head is like laughing at him.
Yeah.
And it's just like, you don't know if he's just like completely freaking lost it by that point, or if the spirits are fucking with him.
I feel, and that's like one of the things that I really like about this film, was that at least for this portion, the horror was really all entrenched with the idea that you just didn't know. You had no way of really dealing with these moments.
And that's why I think the comedy still does have a creepy undertone to all of it. While the comedy is very, very effective, it's decidedly just as much of a horror movie. It's just using the absurdity of the comedy to underscore just how insane this situation is.
There is a thing in literature that we've talked about on this podcast before. It's called slipstream, a relatively recent phenomena to the point where this genre name, I forget the actual origins of it, but it is being used to assign more to weird fiction now. And the idea is essentially like one of the subgenres of slipstream, or one of the things that makes slipstream is the idea of absurdism mixed with horror. A really famous example of this in the podcast community is Welcome to Night Vale, or A Voice from Darkness. So Welcome to Night Vale leans more on the comedy side, and mixes its comedy with the horror. And when you listen to that show, sometimes it's incredibly funny, and sometimes it is incredibly disturbing. It is like actually really good horror fiction. But at the same time, there's this disconnect that's always being meddled with, and it has to do again with the fact that comedy and horror both use the same principles of creating tension and then releasing tension. And one of the things here is that this is an early example. This might actually be an early example of slipstream in film, based off of that.
Yeah, maybe. And well, it's really different than even like most other horror comedies. Like, I don't know, if you Tucker and Dale versus Evil is like one of my favorite movies, but that movie uses horror tropes to make you laugh. This movie, I think, uses comedic tropes to scare you.
That's the difference between satire and being your own piece of media.
And that's no shade towards Tucker and Dale. They're very different aim for that movie.
No. And there's nothing wrong with either of those premises. It's just that the core difference between satire and other pieces of media is that satire requires an understanding of the media or concepts that are being satired. It requires that you if you're satiring horror tropes, it requires that you actually understand those horror tropes and either what's problematic or what makes them kind of work and what doesn't and what's overused. This is the reason why the early scary movies worked so well, is that they just took current films and spoofed them, but they also commented really poorly on some of the stuff that would happen in these horror films that were just silly and stupid and were kind of bad tropes. And like one of the biggest versions of it is like everyone commenting on like, oh, white people are fucking idiots in all these films. This is not something that like any other group of people would do. And it's like, this is only believable because of this. And what's even funnier is that the horror movies are aware of this to some extent.
There's a gag in Scream 2, I think.
Yes.
Where not only are the first people to die on screen in that movie black, all of the other black characters, save for one, figure out something weird is going on, and they just get the fuck out of town.
Yeah, the initial idea of satire is like, okay, we're making fun of the fact that there is this weird racial undertone in all these horror films that imply this, but there's also this cultural difference that is informing the audience reaction here. And then this film, while there's comedy, it's not commenting on a single trope. People still fall into those tropes, and I will say, when they fall into those tropes, you actually notice less. In this film, I think, there is the entire, like, moment of, like, the redneck just does not trust Ash and is, like, mostly out for blood before anything even goes down.
I mean, to be fair, if you're seeing that from the redneck's point of view, would you trust Ash if you're walking into that scene?
God, no. I would be the person advocating to like lock Ash in the basement, and then when something started happening down there, I'd be like, "Hey guys, we're just leaving. He's staying here. We'll call in the police." I don't think I would have survived that movie based off of everything else I saw. I think I'd be a very dead man if I were in that.
The decision making from the characters who come into the, like, when the second act starts is actually like pretty solid for horror movie standards.
The fact that they walk in on Ash and there's immediately this form of conflict that is, as far as you guys are concerned, just killed this girl's parents. You have no reason to trust. Everything that they do makes perfect fucking sense.
Speaking of Ash, we would be remiss if we didn't spend at least a minute or two talking about how different he is in this movie. This is what, when people idolize Bruce Campbell, it's because of this movie. It's not because of the other one. He gets his one-liner groovy in there. He gets the chainsaw hand. He gets like wisecracking. He's a lot more confident in this film. He really comes into his own as like a comedic performer, both physically and otherwise. Without him performing the way he does, this movie just doesn't work.
I'd agree with that. So I think with that, we're going to wrap it up for today, because thank you all.
There is one more thing I want to get into real quick. One more thing.
What do you got? What do you got?
It's just okay. So there's an Evil Dead musical, and the musical adapts mainly parts 1 and part 2, and like depending on who's producing the stage musical, there's a little bit of Army of Darkness in there, but they just kind of run out of time at the end. It has like, it calls out the weird switches in continuity between 1 and 2 in a really funny way. So the first act of the musical is just Evil Dead 1, up until the point where he cuts his hand off. So it's Evil Dead 1 and the first half of Evil Dead 2. And so the group of people come into the cabin and see him with his bloody stump, and there's just dead bodies all over the place because his friends are still there. And then that's how the first act ends. And then the second act begins, and half of those bodies are gone, and it's just the girlfriend this time. And they're like, where'd all the bodies go? I don't know.
That is actually excellent. I feel like if that was the first time you watched anything Evil Dead, that might be fucking ridiculous. But wow, what an excellent call out. Oh God. God, we're gonna have to fucking talk about the musical at some point, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Yes, we are.
Okay. Well, with that and with Army of Darkness ahead, we will see you all next week. The video podcast will be out a week early, so if you want to just jump into the next piece, you may do so via our Patreon. Other than that, this has been The Return of the Movie. Like, comment, and subscribe, and just let us know how we're doing down in the comments. We'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star review, and don't forget to follow there. It really helps us out in the long run. Also, feel free to check out our other shows, including The Armitage Account, which is a little bit more of a spooky podcast with narrative and a bunch of fun stuff. We hope you like it. Bye-bye.